Hey, everyone. Welcome to Disgorged Online. Thanks for joining me this Wednesday, the 1st of April. March is gone, which I guess is probably good news for most of us. And at least if you're in Seattle or Seattle area, it's a beautiful day out right now, which is kind of nice. Today, we're going to be talking about Côtes de Rhône. For myself, I've got Gigal, one of the larger producers in the region, makes this whole bunch of wine. The Côtes de Rhône Rouge, this wine being their largest production, but they make a number of wines from individual appellations in both the southern and northern Rhône, and I'll get into the distinction in just a minute here. But this is, like I said, their most widely produced bottling. This is the 2015, which is what it was at Ballard Market when I went shopping. Some of you may have different wines out there, different vintages. One thing that I'll get into in a minute is the differences in vintages in the Southern Rhône are a little less important than they are in a lot of other parts of France and in the world, frankly. In general, the growing conditions and the climate in the Southern Rhône is pretty consistent year to year, not every single year, not every single vintage, but that's a safer assumption there than it is in a lot of the rest of the France. And a lot of that is because when we're talking about the Southern Rhône, we're sort of talking about the southeastern part of France, not all the way down to the Mediterranean, but sort of centered around Avignon, not too far from Lyon, for those of you who are familiar with French geography. We talk about the Rhône Valley as being two pretty discrete parts: the Northern Rhône, which is obviously to the north, and the Southern Rhône, obviously to the south. And so the difference, the functional difference is twofold. One is sort of geographic. The vineyards in the Northern Rhône really kind of hug the river. It's much steeper. The valley is much steeper there. And so the vineyard land that's planted is basically all on slopes that kind of overlook the river. As you kind of move your way out of that part of the river valley, and the sort of terrain flattens out into a really broad alluvial sort of delta, you end up with these sort of much more gentle rolling hills, the Côtes du Rhône. So côte in French means hill. And as a result, you have a more gentle landscape. It's also warmer, and that makes a big difference in terms of both the varieties that are grown there and the style of wine. And the north is, as far as red wines go, is dominated by Syrah. There is, in some of the appellations, you're allowed to blend in small amounts of white grapes, but the only red grape of note is Syrah. Whereas in the south, you have Syrah, but it's not the dominant grape most of the time. Grenache is, but along with a host of other varieties like Mourvèdre, Cinsault, Cunoise, and so on. We'll mostly be talking about Grenache because it's the principal grape in the region and a really fascinating wine grape. But it is, of course, important to note that very few of these wines are going to be single variety, and especially in the case of a Côtes de Rhône labeled wine, you almost never will find it a single variety. There are very few exceptions. Additionally, and I guess I should also mention this, when you find a wine that's labeled Côtes de Rhône, despite the fact that it could technically be made anywhere in the broader Rhône Valley, so north or south, or even blended together, almost always you're going to get wines that are from grapes that are grown in the south, and that's because it's a lot. There's a lot more vineyards planted there, and it's easier to grow. Grenache, one of the reasons why it's become the dominant variety in the area is that it is a relatively high yielding variety. It has other challenges, but it does produce a lot of fruit, which means you get a lot of wine. A little bit more about the Southern Rhône as a place before we get into the wine specifically. Sorry, yes, my mother clarifies. Côte means side, but in the terms of wine, it really means hillside. When talking, or escarpment, and when talking about wine, and when you see it on the label, it's really what it refers to. Even though, yes, the technical French definition is just side, but they mean hillside in this case. A couple other things to note as far as the broader sort of geography and growing conditions in the Southern Rhône. As I mentioned, most of the area is sort of this big alluvial delta where all this sediment has emptied out from the Rhône River. And as a result, you have this mixture of clay, gravel, sand, and then riverstone. And most famously in probably the most famous appellation in the Southern Rhône, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, where the dominant sort of soil structure includes these galette, or what are called like pudding stones. In other words, these sort of rounded river rock, usually made of quartzite, and they are everywhere. And if you go, as I've been to vineyards there, it really is pretty striking. They are they cover the ground. And actually, it's really interesting. Those of you again who are in the in Washington or in the area, the Rocks district in Walla Walla is really fascinating because it has a very similar composition. There's these same kind of tumbled, relatively large river stones that dominate the sort of surface level. But what's interesting is in Châteauneuf-du-Pape and in the Rhône, they tend to be a few feet deep, maybe up to 5 or 6 feet, all the way maybe to 10 or 12 in the deepest areas. Whereas in the Rocks District in Washington, or actually technically in Oregon, in Walla Walla, we're talking hundreds of feet in some cases, and it has to do with the Missoula floods and the total volume of material that was dumped. But that's another pod or another episode here. The last defining feature of the region would be the Mistral wind, which is a wind that blows in from the Massif Central, large sort of mountain range in the center of France, and it's cold and dry. And this is really important in the Southern Rhône because, as we'll get to in a second here, it's a very hot, pretty dry area in general, and the Mistral serves to cool down the grapes, cool down the vineyards. And also, in the case of a variety like Grenache, which has real issues with rot and other kinds of spoilage, the wind helps keep the grapes clean, and that's also another thing that makes it sort of possible to grow Grenache there in great quantity and great quality in a lot of cases. Okay, so speaking of quality, so as I mentioned, Côtes du Rhône is kind of the most basic appellation in the region, and it essentially just means that the wine came from within the broader Rhône region. And it's an appellation that you will see on a lot of wine. Within the broader Rhône appellation, there are smaller appellations. There is Côtes du Rhône Village, which means that the wine can come from, I think there are 19 named villages in the Côtes du Rhône appellation, but it means that the wine comes from one or more of those. And those can be blended together, but they are generally considered, those villages are considered slightly higher tier, and then each individual village has its own name, some of which have been granted their own AOP, Appellation Origine Protégée. Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which I mentioned a minute ago, is the most famous of those, but some others like Gigondas and Vaqueira are very similar in terms of to some extent in terms of quality and history, and they are also similarly delimited. So you can find those wines as well. In most cases, you will still find the same basic composition of grapes, Grenache dominant, with other varieties blended in, but those rules are, their guidelines are not hard and fast rules, unfortunately. So as we move from something like Côtes du Rhône to a specific village wine, your price is going to go up. So that's an important thing to consider for the most part. And theoretically, quality will go up. I think that is not 100% true. There's some excellent Côtes du Rhône out there. There's also some crappy appellated wines and some crappy specific village wines, including Châteauneuf-du-Pape, frankly. Just because the grapes come from a specific place doesn't inherently make them great, although it is the best wines from the region do tend to come from these specific villages. So, as you taste, as you try, you can kind of make your own determinations to some extent about whether the quality increase is there for you. But the price increase will definitely be there. So something to be aware of. Okay, for those of you who are drinking along with, which is hopefully all of you, let's taste. And actually, with these wines in particular, I think it's important to do a couple of things before you really taste the wine. And one of them is definitely to smell it. And one of the reasons that you want to smell it, besides just sort of appreciating it, is in the Southern Rhône, as in a few other regions in France, like Bordeaux, to some extent Burgundy, there can be more or less prevalence of what you could refer to by a lot of different names. So you could call it funk. You could call it sort of barnyard smells. We tend to sort of technically refer to it as Brettanomyces because that's the microbe that produces these aromas. But basically, what you will find very commonly in these wines, not in every single one, but in many of them, is a smell that, depending on the level of it in the wine and your own personal preference and tolerance, could smell pleasant, could smell like, wood smoke, clove, could smell kind of like a barnyard, which may or may not be a positive thing, depending on your own personal associations there. But it can also, frankly, smell really unpleasant to a lot of people. The good and the bad with Brettanomyces is that it's pretty hard to avoid for a lot of these wineries, because once it gets established in a winery, and in many cases it's been established in these wineries for decades or centuries, it's very, very hard to get rid of. The positive is we understand better now how to control it a little bit in the winemaking process. And also at lower levels, for most of us, it does produce sort of some pleasant, sort of savory aromas that most people tend to enjoy, at least in low levels. It's only when it gets really out of control that it can be unpleasant. The second is that a lot of those aromas are very, very volatile. So if you open the bottle, pour the glass, and smell it, and you find it really too much, you can at least theoretically decant the wine or pour it in the glass and let it sit for a little bit, swirl it a few times, and at least the most intense aromas should dissipate. I'll tell you though, I've bought bottles in the past that I couldn't drink. They were just too, and I have a pretty high tolerance for Brettanomyces, but I couldn't do it. It just was too gross, and that sucks, but it happens from time to time. Like I said, it's becoming less common, but it is definitely, unfortunately, out there. Outside of that smell, things that we would expect to find in these wines. So from a fruit profile, both on the nose and then on the palate when we taste, again, we're dealing with a warm growing climate. So we're going to expect riper fruit character and a sense of kind of almost baked or cooked fruit. And I think in a good Côtes de Rhône or Grenache-based wine from that area, that those flavors are welcome. I mean, they're not, I don't want the wine personally to taste like or to smell like a pie exactly, but a little hint of that, a little bit of, like I said, that kind of baked fruit character is actually something that I'm looking for in these wines and that I appreciate. Maybe even a little hint of raisination. And then we're looking at kind of a mix of fruits here as well. You might get some really kind of ripe, like luscious red raspberry. You might get blackberry, blueberry, even some like kind of plum notes as well. Grenache can produce a lot of different fruit profile or fruit flavors. And then when you factor in that most of these wines are blends, you're going to get a pretty broad fruit spectrum, which, as I'll come to in a minute, is kind of one of the reasons to blend, both in this region and in general. And then also things that you would expect to find on these wines, in addition to sort of the Brettanomyces sort of savory elements that I noticed, you might very well expect to find sort of the traditional herbs like herb de Provence, because again, we're near Provence here. So things like sage, rosemary, even lavender. You might expect to find a pretty pronounced meaty note. Grenache often has kind of a smell that we associate with things like cured meats, even blood. I don't find it in the wine that I have specifically, but that bloody quality can definitely be there in other expressions of Grenache from the region and other parts of the world. And then on the palate, for a Côtes de Rhône, we're expecting medium-bodied, a reasonable amount of alcohol. We're not expecting a whole lot of depth of flavor. That is one thing that I think you'll get as you move up in quality, is a little richer wine, a little more intensity. These wines are made in large quantities from vineyards that are very productive at relatively high yields. And here what we're really getting at is the sort of fruit character, a little bit of that savory note, and a wine that's very drinkable. We're not necessarily expecting to find profundity, I guess, for lack of a better way to describe it. And that's no knock on the wine. I mean, this is a $15 bottle of wine. I would rarely expect to find profundity in a bottle at that price point. Every now and then. Other things to be aware of, Grenache in general is not necessarily a very tannic variety. As I will get to when we talk a little more about the variety itself, it's thin-skinned, which again means it's prone to these sort of issues with rot and other kinds of damage to the grape, but it also means that we're not going to get a lot of color necessarily, and we're not going to get necessarily a lot of tannin. Now, blending, as again is critical to these wines, will bring in some of that color and tannin from varieties like Syrah and Mourvedre, and that's a big part of why they're blended. But even so, the Grenache being the dominant variety usually means that we won't expect a ton of tannin. We will expect a moderate amount of acidity. It's not going to necessarily be super high. We'll probably see a little bit more in these Côtes de Rhône than we would in a Châteauneuf de Pape, because we're dealing again with higher yields, which means you tend to get a little bit less ripeness in general. And then the last thing that I think you would expect to find in here is a relatively high level of alcohol for a French wine. I mean, not like crazy high. And now that I say that, I'm going to look at what it says on the label here. So this is 14%, which for Côtes de Rhône is pretty standard. As you move up in quality to some of the single village wines, you might expect to see 14.5, 15, or even higher although rarely labeled like that. But it's pretty common. Again, Grenache ripens pretty aggressively. It's hot. You get a lot of sugar, and so you can expect to find some pretty boozy Chateauneuf de Pape. It's one of the reasons why that wine and others from that single vineyard wines or single village wines, I'm sorry, are often kind of good transition wines for people who are used to sort of more intense, ripe, higher alcohol styles of New World wines, whether from the U.S. or other parts of the New World. Because that riper fruit character and that alcohol level are a little more familiar. But for those of you who are, on the other hand, are really more into sort of leaner, more sort of lighter European wines, this may be as far as people are willing to go. So something to take note of. So let's talk a little bit more about Grenache, as I mentioned. So one of the fun things about it is, even though in a lot of cases in wine circles we associate Grenache with this region, its origins are really in Spain as Garnacha. But it's grown in Spain, it's grown in France, and interestingly, it's grown on the island of Sardinia, even though it's not really grown in Italy anywhere else. It's been planted recently, but historically not. It's also grown here in the US, of course, and a lot of other New World regions. I think most interestingly in Australia. There's some really old vine Grenache in Australia, in particular in like the Barossa region, and some of the most kind of highly regarded, most expensive wines out of Australia are made from Grenache. A wine called Hill of Grace from a producer called Henschke, which if any of you have a bottle lying around and want to share it with me when this was all over, I would be so happy to come have a glass. But that's okay if you don't. So I mentioned Syrah, which we'll probably come to in an episode not too long from now and focus on a little more. So I'm not going to go into too much detail other than that Syrah is often blended in because it'll add color, it adds tannin, it adds a little bit of acid, and it adds a complementary flavor set. Darker fruit profile, but a lot of the same kind of meaty, gamey flavor that we would expect and smell that we would expect from Grenache. Same with Mourvèdre. So Mourvèdre is kind of like Syrah's wild cousin. And again, there we're looking at bringing in some flavor and aroma, as well as acidity, even more than with Syrah. Mourvèdre, so Grenache is a late ripening grape. Mourvèdre is even later ripening. So rarely does it reach like really full levels of ripeness, which means that it's still got a lot of that sort of fresh acid that kind of helps brighten up these wines that with ripe Grenache and Syrah might be a little bit flabby otherwise. And then Cinsault, Cunoise, a bunch of others that are blending companions as well. And this is a great time to talk about blending. I'm sure we will have other blends coming up, but this is a great example of a place in a style of wine where blending is not just customary, but really appropriate in a lot of ways. And so to step back for a second, when we talk about blending, it's important to kind of understand why historically blending happened. And blending happened for a few reasons in winemaking. One was because a lot of vineyards up until relatively recent times, with some exceptions, were really planted to, people didn't really understand, our modern conception of a variety and of different varieties and all that was pretty, it's pretty recent. And even now we're still learning much more, but it's only in the last century or so that we've really come to the point where we can understand, okay, what differentiates varieties from one another, how different are they? And this idea of planting a block of variety X and then adjacent a block of variety Y, and we really treat those differently, is a very modern winemaking concept. In most other for most of history, vines were, if they were even planted with some sense of intentionality, it was usually a range of varieties were planted, or as it turned out, I mean, basically individual vines were propagated and planted wherever there was favorable conditions and space and all that. And as a result, you had vineyards that were blends themselves. And so it was, no one was going through and saying, okay, well, today we're going to walk through this vineyard and we're going to only pick the Grenache. We might only pick what's ripe. We might make a couple of passes in the vineyard, but we're not differentiating variety. So blending in many cases happened at the vineyard level before even, at the harvest at the latest. It didn't happen in the winery at all. But even when there were different varieties and they were kept separate and they were then blended, again, the idea for most wineries was to produce, and again, our modern conceptions are so driven by what we see now. But if you were making wine, you were making at most one wine. So you were never going to make, here's my single variety Grenache, here's my single variety Syrah, here's my, Cunoise Cinsault blend. I mean, that's such a modern idea. even, specific to kind of places like the United States, but even in other, even in Europe, rarely would wineries make, these sort of many different wines, with some very few exceptions in specific places. And so this idea that, so everything all the grapes you picked, all the juice you pressed, all the fermented, the wine you had was blended together and bottled or sort of packaged in some fashion and consumed. And so the blend was just inherent, because if you had a vineyard, you probably grew a number of different varieties. And the main reason for that was to hedge against the variety and variance in a harvest. So, if you look at a lot of these blending components in the Rhône, as in other places, you have a range of varieties, some of which flower early and some of which flower late, which allows you to have to protect against sort of early season frost or hail. If you have an early flowering variety, it could be really damaged by those events. You also have late and early ripening varieties, so that, again, if you have unfavorable weather at the end of the harvest, your early ripening varieties you've already picked. Your late ripening varieties, maybe you lose some of them. Again, if you have weather events or just the weather gets really cold or whatever. And in the Rhône, that's a little less of a concern, but still, weather is always unpredictable. Again, this was all long before the advent of long-range forecasting. So again, you're really not basing your decisions or your understanding of the weather on much more than sort of accumulated knowledge and maybe what your parents or your grandparents thought or told you. So it was important to have diversity. It was important to have a sort of a robust ecosystem of grape varieties, so that you were always able to make wine. Because again, so much of what we now take as sort of codified law was really born out of a need for wine every year. And the number one and most important thing was that we made some amount of wine because how else were you going to survive? So blending was really a thing of first and foremost of sort of practicality, but then also evolved to maximize quality, right? And so as it turns out, these sort of differing characteristics and varieties also mean that they tend to have different flavors. And so blending also allowed you to make a wine that had a more broad and diverse flavor palette. But again, like I said, I want to emphasize, blending was historically much more about a form of insurance than it was about magnifying quality. It has come to take on that role, which I think is really cool. But it's not necessarily something that is that was done initially for that reason. It just kind of arose that way. All right, so we're going to wrap up by talking a little bit about kind of how to enjoy this wine, what goes with it. First point of order for me. So I'm, as soon as we kind of wrap up here, I am going to move over to my kitchen, which is mere feet away, and get started on dinner, which for us is going to be cheeseburgers, because that's one of my favorite pairings with this kind of wine. I love Côtes and Grenache-based wines with a good rare cheeseburger, medium rare maybe. And the reason for that is kind of twofold. One is, if you think about, I sometimes like to think about wine, and this is a very Italian concept, although it's true with a lot of European kind of food traditions or food and wine traditions, is I love to think about the wine kind of as pairing kind of like a condiment. So I'm not a fan of ketchup. It's not something I would put on my burger, but a lot of people like it. And this wine is kind of vaguely ketchup-y to me. Like, it's fruity. It's got some tartness. It's got a little bit of earthiness or kind of meatiness to it, which obviously you wouldn't necessarily find in ketchup. But it kind of works in that way. It works really well with the ground meat. It works really well with the sort of richness of the cheese. It works really well with even like the sort of bready flavors, slight sweetness in like a brioche bun, which thank you, Caitlin, for making. So that kind of flavor profile works really well. It's certainly possible to pair this with a lot of different meat dishes. I will say, though, that for me, with wines made from Grenache, I tend to prefer to pair them with like not very meaty meats. And that might be counterintuitive because there's a lot of meatiness in this wine, but I actually find that like pairing this with game actually gets a little bit over the top. So I like things like beef. Lamb you could certainly do, but I wouldn't necessarily want to pair a wine like this with something like venison. I would actually prefer to reserve that for something that has a little bit less of a gamey character itself. I also think, again, like the fruitiness in this wine works really well with that sort of fun. Like this is like, I mean, in the end, especially with the Côtes du Rhône, like not a very serious wine, and in a very positive way. Like I said earlier, it's a wine that's meant to be kind of enjoyed. It's relatively simple, and so too is a cheeseburger, and they're delicious. I love them, but they're not the most sophisticated dish, and so they're great. It's great to kind of pair a more straightforward, simple food with a sort of more straightforward, simple wine. Not that you can't have great times with complex food and simple wine, or complex wine and simple food, but oftentimes I find that the pairings work really well when you kind of match the intentionality of the food and wine, I suppose. So yeah, I think that's kind of it for the Côtes du Rhône. I don't know. I was kind of quiet in the chat here, but if you guys have any questions or anything, I'm going to sit here and sip a little bit, and then if not, I will catch you back on Saturday, same time, 5:30. Let me pull the bottle right now because I've got it right here behind me. So we'll be moving to Piedmont in northwestern Italy and drinking some Barbaresco. For those of you who don't want to go out and buy this exact wine, any Barbaresco, Barolo, Longue Nebbiolo should do the trick for a lot of what we're going to talk about. And I hope to see you all back here on Saturday. Thanks so much for joining me on Disgorged Online, and I will see you soon.